Welcome, everybody, to No Buzzwords. Thanks for tuning in on YouTube, Spotify, and Facebook. We're super excited to get another episode going. We have in studio Nathan Walker, founder of Resolved in Steel and possessor of an incredible mustache.
Yeah, it takes some upkeep, but yeah.
Exactly. Thanks for coming on the show, man.
Hey, it's my pleasure.
We really appreciate it.
It's my first podcast.
Yeah.
So you found out about Nathan while playing basketball, but Nathan and his crew, they don't play basketball. They do something much different.
Right. So
at the basketball court.
Yes. So I play basketball poorly. I mostly just do it for exercise.
Sure. Go Pacers.
And by the time this comes out, that may be settled.
That may be.
So Rob Park in Poulsbo, after work I'll go there and I'll shoot some hoops. And there was 3 times when I got there and there was 2 dudes done up in black armor with these masks and humongous swords. And I remember driving up and just thinking like, dang it, they took the good hoop. I was like, I'm going to play on the crappy hoop today, I guess. But yeah, that happened like 3 times, and I was just like, working on my free throws with this shing, shing in the background, and they had a camera, they were filming it, and so just this last week, I was like, man, these guys are here pretty consistently. They're clearly like very invested in what they're doing, and I don't have a guest for this Saturday. So I was like, they probably know somebody who's got an interesting story.
They probably know some weirdo.
Yeah, they probably know somebody who's got an interesting story. And so I walked up to Tyler. Shout out to Tyler. Thank you for the connection. And I said, what are you guys? What is this? What's happening? And he gave me just a fantastic pitch for your studio.
No kidding.
Yeah, and he was like, Nathan's the guy. He's the one that we're learning from. He's the one that you'd want to talk to. And so, I'm just really appreciative. Thanks for reaching out. I mean, this is the first time we've met each other, so that's been sort of a theme. We've had a bunch of people we have never met until they're sitting right in front of us. So thanks for being bold and coming into a mysterious garage to record.
7 o'clock. It was 7 o'clock in the morning is better than like 9 o'clock at night. So.
Yeah.
It's a little creepier.
Exactly. So we were talking a little bit. You ended up in Washington kind of when you were younger.
Yeah, about 10. It was like actually I got here a week before my 10th birthday. Wow. That was a while back. Man, I'm getting old. And when it happened, man.
Yeah. So what's the story from you arriving here and then finding yourself into this niche? Is it fair to call it niche?
Oh, I would say it's very niche, yeah.
Okay.
Well, let's see. I first got started with fencing. In fact, I think I was younger than 10. But it was modern fencing. You guys familiar with modern fencing in some capacity, right?
I've watched it in like the Olympics or whatever.
Sure. Yeah. That's most people's first exposure to fencing. In fact, usually only exposure to fencing. Mm-hmm. And you get the little tiny, incredibly thin, whippy little swords.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I never know what's happening when I'm watching that because it's so fast.
They move so fast, so fast.
It's just like a point system with that, right?
Yeah. They're looking for points, and it's an interesting history for modern fencing. I appreciate modern fencing for what it is, and that was my first experience with fencing as well. My mother is actually from this area. She actually started the fencing club at Olympic College in Bremerton, in the 70s, right? So I grew up, and she always had her old fencing equipment, in the closet in her room. So me and my brothers would sneak in there, and we'd steal the swords when we run outside, and we'd hit each other with them.
Yeah.
And we didn't know anything about it.
That is a great childhood for a boy. Wow.
Exactly. In my experience, there's 2 kinds of, young guys, and it's like there's kids who know nothing about sticks, and there's kids who every stick is a sword.
Dude, that was me.
Everybody, get tangled up in the cord here. Everybody that's in the club right now, well, almost everybody, not everybody, but almost everybody was one of those stick kids.
Yeah.
Right? Just always hitting each other with sticks. So that was my first young experience with swords. So, my mom started giving me some pointers, okay, this is how you do a lunge properly. And, it was never really a big thing. But it was just something that was like, in there.
Yeah,
it was an interest of mine. And, through the years, I did it with my friends. I never went to like an official school for modern fencing or anything like that. And then there was a kind of a point in my teens where I discovered shinai. You guys have any idea what a shinai is?
Nope.
Okay, so in kendo, so this is Japanese swordsmanship, they have kind of a competitive wing called kendo. And in kendo, they have these bamboo slatted swords. There's like 4 slats of bamboo, and they're kind of tied together.
I got one of those for a birthday.
Yep.
To smack my friends with.
That's exactly what happened to me. Me and my friends, we discovered these things, and we were like, "Oh crap, we can really whack each other with these things." Again, no formal training in this. I do not claim to have any kind of understanding of kendo.
Just pure violence.
Exactly. It was an interest, and me and some of my friends, we got a hold of a couple of these guys, and we would just spend all day whacking the crap out of each other with these things. Again, teenagers.
Yeah.
But that did kind of bleed over into a general interest in understanding how to do it properly. So, I went and found books about it. When the internet came around, I was looking it up online. And I learned a bunch of stuff, but I never attended an official, kendo school or anything like that. It was just a general interest in swordsmanship. Then there was, of course, college. College is a great place to meet other people that enjoy the things that you enjoy, and that's when I really started
Was that at
getting
Olympic?
into. It was not. Well, let's see. Yes, but that's not where I started fencing. So I did go to Olympic College for a couple of years, and I got my associate's degree. And once I had that, I transferred to BYU, Idaho. I grew up Mormon. Not Mormon now, but I grew up Mormon. And I did, do the whole mission thing. I was a missionary in Brazil for a couple of years.
Oh man, we got a whole nother episode now.
Right.
I just got back from Salt Lake 2 weeks.
No kidding. No kidding.
Nice.
So, when I was in Brazil, I started picking up capoeira, and that's a whole nother story. If you're familiar with capoeira.
No. Oh, you went to Brazil.
Yeah, I spent 2 years in Brazil.
Oh, and that's where you did your mission.
That's where I did the mission.
No, okay, all right.
Started learning capoeira while I was there. Capoeira is the national martial art of Brazil. So this kind of is completely unrelated to fencing, but it's another extremely niche martial art.
Well, the theme of today's episode is just your story. So if you, it doesn't have to be swords. It could just be whatever makes you cool.
Put a pin in that. I have questions about that once but keep going.
So when I got back from my mission, finished my associate's degree, went to college at BYU, Idaho, and they had both a fencing club and a capoeira club. So immediately joined both, and I started really doing modern fencing with some seriousness.
So capoeira is a martial art that involves a sword.
No.
Oh, okay.
It is actually an unarmed martial art. If you were to imagine Brazilian breakdance fighting, you wouldn't be far off.
Wow, interesting.
So it's like
Who is there's a UFC fighter that does it right now. He's like really good at it too. I forget his name.
I think there's a couple of them. I want to say Alex Pereira.
Alex, yeah, maybe.
I'm not familiar with the fighters. Yeah,
yeah, I don't remember. I think. Well, I mean, I know he's Brazilian. I think he does capoeira. But anyway, that one's a whole lot of fun. It's so like back during the whole slave trade thing, they were importing a lot of people to the Americas, and for every single slave that came to North America, there was about 12 that went to South America. And so there was a much larger African population in South America than there was in North America. And, of course, the Portuguese at the time, who were basically running all the plantations in Brazil, they outlawed native martial arts for, the African population. And they had, all kinds of martial understanding, as most of the world did at the time. Coming back to fencing. So they weren't allowed to do that anymore. So what they did is they mixed their martial arts with music and dance, and they told the slavers that it was just a folk dance they'd been doing since the dawn of time. But it was really a clever way to preserve their martial arts understanding. Yeah, so it's, when you do capoeira, it's all about music and it's about flow, and it's kind of a martial game that you play with someone. And it's, communal. You get a big circle of people and everybody's clapping and singing and playing instruments. And you're also fighting and dancing at the same time.
Wow.
It's a lot of fun.
That's amazing.
That one's an even harder sell than fencing, though. Damn.
Actually, just coming back from Salt Lake, I do jiu-jitsu, so that was kind of my pin with the Brazil thing. I didn't realize that, because you would think when you're here in Brazil that their national sport would be jiu-jitsu, since Brazilian jiu-jitsu, but I didn't know that was their national sport. But
martial art, anyway.
Just
I think probably soccer is their national sport.
Probably, yeah. But this school, school I went to in Salt Lake, one of my drop-ins I did, it was a combination of the capoeira and jiu-jitsu, and it was really interesting to see some of these guys in the way that was like I'll just roll normally and do jiu-jitsu.
Well, it's a really cool combination. Yeah. Because jiu-jitsu, Brazilian jiu-jitsu particularly, you don't see a lot of striking unless it's like ground and pound, that kind of stuff. A way to get in and get somebody to the ground, right? With capoeira, you kind of have the opposite, where you're not really looking to grapple a lot. There are some grapples, they're like takedowns, but nothing happens on the ground except for capoeira. You can do there's capoeira Angola, which is like low and slow, and there's a lot of standing on your hands and rolling around.
The way they were getting up was like, I mean, in jiu-jitsu we have like technical get-ups where you're keeping people at a distance and you're very methodical about it. But they were like, it was like a breakdance get-up. They were like coming over the back of their hands and spinning their legs around and grabbing their neck. Yep,
there's a ton of that cool stuff. But the danger with capoeira is that if you don't know how to do anything on the ground, there's a lot of, we'll say, high-risk maneuvers. A lot of jumping, spinning kicks, a lot of high kicks, a lot of stuff where you could easily be taken down. And it actually complements that fighting style to have a really good jiu-jitsu understanding, or, at least just some kind of grappling. Because if you do get taken down, it's not a big deal. You know how to handle yourself on the ground. So capoeira and Brazilian jiu-jitsu go together really, really well.
Yeah. So are you a master in capoeira as well?
I would not say that I am a master now.
Okay.
More of a practitioner. But the thing is that it's almost impossible to find capoeira around here. I had to go to West Seattle to find the closest place that actually teaches capoeira. I've tried to start up a couple of capoeira groups over here, but it's just
not taken.
Yeah, it's so hard so much of it is like just rooted in the culture, and there's none of the culture over here. So, in some larger areas, you think you get a broader kind of idea of what kind of people are there.
Sure.
And you get more people with some Brazilian background, some understanding, and you can get a group going. But out here, it always just peters out.
It's a hard sell with the tech boys.
Yep. It is.
So how did fencing eventually get into this? You're down in Brazil, you're seeing this national martial art of theirs, and then how does fencing come in there?
So the fencing came in, it was also when I was in college. I really started to get into Olympic fencing, right? And I was doing mostly foil, and there's 3 sword types. You have foil, épée, and saber, and they're all relatively similar. They're incredibly thin, relatively short, kind of mid-length weapons, and it was a lot of fun. I was young, I was fast. Those kind of things are very important when you're using a very light weapon, because since you really can't see them when they're moving. A lot of it is on instinct and reaction time. So it worked out real well for me. I was very happy with modern fencing at the time. But then I graduated, and I came back to Kitsap. I got back from college, and I was looking for something somewhere I could fence, and that's where I ran across the SCA. So I was actually not unlike you. I was out in a park, and I saw a bunch of dudes fencing, and they were fencing with rapiers. Now, rapiers, I don't know if you guys know what rapiers are. Basically, they're long, skinny thrusting weapons.
Okay.
They're not too incredibly different from, say, modern fencing weapons, but they're much more robust. So you have a much longer blade, a much heavier blade. You have much more hand protection. You have keons, which are these little pieces of metal that kind of stick out on the sides. They're used for catching blades and controlling blades. And they're just all around much, much heavier. So we go from somewhere around half a pound with like a modern fencing weapon to a rapier being somewhere around 2 to 2.5 pounds. So
big difference.
Completely different, and significantly longer. And I thought it was fascinating. So I was like, these guys seem to be doing something fun. Let me get in on this. And that's when I joined the SCA. Now, the SCA is a recreationist organization. So you go to an SCA event, everyone's dressed up in garb, as they say. You know, you got to put on the costume, and everybody has a historical persona and all that. If you've ever been to the medieval fair that's hosted here in Kitsap, that was the group that I joined, the ones that put on that medieval fair.
Sweet. But
it's kind of a global organization. You got SCA chapters pretty much all over the world at this point. Well, in most parts of the world. There's some places, but and now that was very interesting to me. I did that for a long time, somewhere around 15 years. And I competed in a ton of tournaments, and I even won the regional tournament for Pacific Northwest. This is a while back now. But yeah, that's that included fencers from all over Washington and Oregon.
No kidding.
Also Montana, Idaho, and British Columbia as well.
Nice.
Yeah. So that was probably my high point as far as tournaments go.
Wow.
But, yeah, been at that for quite a while. Excuse me. Now, right about COVID, when COVID hit, the whole SCA scene basically died. It was just impossible to get together and fence. And so me and a couple of my friends were like, hey, we just go to a park. We got a recurring theme of going to parks.
Yeah.
So we're like, let's just go down to the park and we'll just have some fun, practice, whatever, since we can't go to these SCA events during COVID. And, of course, just like you guys, you see something weird, you go ask questions about it. Hey, what are you guys doing? Oh, we're doing, this is Italian rapier, And, pretty soon we had 4 or 5 guys join us. Then it was, 7, 8 guys. And, then they're all like, well, how do you actually do this? We want to learn how to do this properly. And so started teaching them.
Yeah.
And that kind of brought us to where we're at. It just kind of grew and grew and grew.
Cool. So what park was that at?
Which one? We have a couple of parks.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, okay. So basically during COVID, that's where Resolved in Steel was born.
Yeah.
At the parks, and people were looking for something to do, and there was enough people, naturally generated interest for you to think to yourself, oh, I'm going to go rent a space.
Yeah, pretty much. And there was also a pretty big change in there from the SCA to HEMA. The difference being, of course, that the SCA is a recreationist organization, like I said. So, you give yourself a historical profile, you have a funny name, you dress up in, historical gear. We don't do any of that. So HEMA is pretty much, it's a tournament organization, but it's really just to facilitate the fighting. There's none of the extra historical baggage, I guess you might say, which I appreciate because I was never super into the historical recreationist part of things. I go to the medieval fair, I'll go to the Renaissance fair. It's a hoot, but it's not really why I'm there, right? I'm interested in the martial art of it. And that's where things get really interesting because the martial art aspect of it is real and significant. So, I mean, you've done martial arts. Have you done martial arts before in any capacity?
No. Maybe when I was like 8.
Yeah. Back in the day, karate in the studio.
Highly recommend. I've been trying to get him to start jiu-jitsu for the last, how long? Long time.
As long as you've been doing it.
Nice. But most martial arts kind of have this living lineage that goes back to somebody somewhere that, pretty much had my situation, right?
Yeah.
Well, the cool thing is that kind of died out for Europe. So like there was a point at which, swordsmanship was just no longer necessary. We had invented guns, and they become good enough that you didn't need a sword as backup. And so the West basically entirely abandoned their own martial arts heritage in favor of, guns. Well, it wasn't necessarily abandoned because, using a gun properly is also a martial art, right?
Oh, okay.
We just changed, and we didn't really practice that anymore. And most of the Western world has entirely forgotten about the martial arts that we used for generations, literally hundreds and even thousands of years.
Right.
And you look at like, Eastern martial arts, and they didn't do that. It was like ingrained in the culture, and those things held on. So they have these long living lineages. You can take Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu all the way back to, Carlos Gracie. And Carlos, learned from some dude over in Japan. I forget who that was. I remember reading the Gracie book way back in the day.
Yeah, I can't remember where it was, but yeah, it's a Japanese art.
Yeah, and it goes back beyond that, back to some point where they're like, yeah, we forget who did this, but but there's that lineage, right? Yeah. The West, we completely forgot about that lineage, and we completely forgot about all of our own native martial arts. So what happened was back in like the 1960s, they started up the SCA, again, back to that same organization doing the recreationist thing. Yeah. And they were just like, hey, let's put on some gear and let's whack each other with sticks. It was what I was doing when I was, 12, 13 years old. And eventually, over the course of time, there were people in that organization that were like, hey, we should learn how to do this properly. And there were a lot of historians, there were a lot of professors, and they were like, hey, I ran across this book. And this book is a manual of how to use such and such a type of sword, and it was written in, 1595, or it was written in 1310, or whatever it was.
Oh, cool.
And the thing is just spelling out exactly how to use this. We could learn how to do this right.
Wow. Some reverse engineering.
Exactly. And so that didn't really happen in the SCA, but it was SCA people back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s that were kind of like splintering off and doing their own thing and trying to understand this. This is where we get organizations like ARMA, WMA, and that's also where HEMA comes from. HEMA is an acronym for Historical European Martial Arts. And HEMA is not a single group, but it is kind of like a confederation, I guess you might say. It's an association of a bunch of different schools that are all doing this same thing, that are saying, okay, we are going to be resurrecting this martial art, understanding everything that we can from the sources, and pressure testing it in tournament.
On each other's foreheads.
Among other places, absolutely.
Wow. So now... my mind went to fencing as you were talking about so much of it being a lost art.
Yeah.
The lineage of fencing, because fencing seems to be so well established.
Yeah.
But it seems to be thanks to the fact that it was entered into the competitive sports world.
That is a really good observation. And one of the fascinating things about living lineages is that they can be corrupted over the course of time. And we see this with other martial arts as well. So if you look at like wushu, right? Wushu is all based on kung fu. I mean, it's a form of kung fu, but it's a form of kung fu that is for demonstration. And please don't quote me on this. I am not an expert in wushu or the history of wushu, but from my understanding, it's not really designed to be a functional martial art, for fighting nowadays. It is something that is for show, for movies, for film, for demonstration, that kind of thing. And it's become corrupted, I would say, as a fighting martial art, because it has a different purpose, if that makes any kind of sense.
Sure.
And I see the same thing that happened in modern Olympic fencing. What we had weapons that were designed to be, very light, very low impact practice weapons to practice for specifically the small sword, for example, for foil. And then, of course, you would have, the saber, which was designed to practice for saber. But the problem is that they were so diminutive, they were so tiny, they were so fast, they were so light, that you end up with a practice weapon that you can do things with that you could never do with a real sword. And even if you took that practice weapon and sharpened it, you couldn't hurt someone with it. So we had this
not
aberration.
To the degree that you'd need to if you found yourself.
Yeah, I mean, you might be able to, if you got the skinny end of a fishing pole and you whip somebody enough with it, you can give them some injury. It's not going to be pleasant.
Right.
But it's not a real, threat to somebody.
Right.
If that makes any kind of sense.
Yeah. That was like one of my big questions for this whole interview is I always... being in jiu-jitsu, you always talk about other martial arts and their effectiveness in a real life situation, like a street fight situation. And then you were just talking about the corruption of martial arts over time, and then what you think then how fencing or the knowledge that you guys practice there at your studio, what that translates to in a real world situation. Is it applicable?
That's one of those things that always comes up. It's like, can we use this in a real situation? Honestly, I feel like HEMA, depending on what you're studying, can absolutely be useful in a real life situation, but it all depends on the context of the situation. So, for example, if all I do is rapier, that is an extremely specialized weapon. It is very long. It is sharp, mostly on the point, though you can cut with it, but you really don't. Most of it is about getting that point into somebody's organs and turning them off. And it's very effective at that. It's excellent at that. But you don't find a lot of like improvised weapons in the world that possess those same characteristics.
Oh, yeah.
So rapier, I would say, is probably one of the less effective in a modern altercation. Just because you're very unlikely to have a rapier on you, right. Even though rapier is one of the most effective personal, handheld weapons in history until the invention of the gun, right? So, like, if I was going into a real sword fight and I had to defend my life, I would take my rapier and dagger over a longsword, over a mezzer, and I'm probably naming a bunch of stuff you guys have never heard of.
I know longsword.
Over a saber, over any other weapon. The rapier, I feel, is the one that is most highly optimized for that situation, which would be me fighting one other person that has an equivalent, sharp piece of metal.
Yeah, I just walked down the wrong dark alley in Seattle in the middle of the night. Good thing I got my rapier.
Rapier, super strong choice for a sword
I got my
fight.
rapier, so I'm not going to get raped here.
Oh, snap. The joke was bad, and you should feel bad. No, I love that. I'm using that.
So I'm looking at pictures of the rapier sword here. So is this like, this is like the classic, this is what I would think of as
Three Musketeers, dude.
Three Musketeers
I
style
love
sword.
that
was that
movie.
The Princess Bride.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So
yeah, they were definitely using rapiers in The Princess Bride, though a lot of saberish technique, a lot of cutting. You don't see a lot of cutting generally in rapier competition, and there's a reason for that. Striking your opponent from as far away as possible, highly advantageous. But again, like I said, it's not something that would be as applicable as, say, saber techniques, because with saber, it's basically just a one-handed cutting weapon. And we have stuff like that all over this. I could grab this mic stand and do a lot of that kind of stuff. Any kind of stick that you pick up, you can use saber technique. If you have a walking stick, you can use saber technique. If you have an umbrella, you can use saber technique.
Kingsman.
When I met Tyler at Robb Park, I asked him about it, and he immediately went into pitching the sport to me.
Sure.
Which I loved. And his I think his big the pro that he presented to me was the exercise value. He was like, it's a great workout. And they were fighting with swords on the basketball court, and I was playing basketball. And basketball has literally no practical use outside of getting a job playing basketball.
Throw a basketball.
Yeah, exactly. It's like it's not like becoming good at basketball is going to make you good at self-defense or anything like that. So it's like,
sure,
wondering about the value of. Well, I guess I just thought that was a very simple, elegant, and very useful explanation of it. I was like, everybody needs to exercise, and why not have fun while you do it? That's why I play basketball, because I'm having fun getting my heart rate up. Yeah.
Yeah, the exercise value, I think, is great. It's definitely a workout. It's actually quite interesting because we use different muscles than pretty much anything else, and I think most activities are like that. If you lift weights, on the regular, and then you go play basketball, you're going to be hurting stuff, in different places than you would by lifting weights.
Right.
And it's the same thing with swordsmanship, and not just that, but even across disciplines. So if you do, rapier all the time, and then you move to longsword, you're using completely different muscles, different stabilization muscles. There's a lot more twisting in the torso. A lot more cutting in longsword, for example. But even beyond just the exercise value, I think that there is value in an understanding of fighting with weapons, because that's usually the way things go, right? Like in a real life altercation. an understanding of sparring. It helps you understand distance and timing. Distance, what we call measures. The amount of distance between yourself and your opponent.
Right.
How to control that measure. How to stay safe in a situation where someone is trying to hurt you. It helps you understand how to manipulate people's minds. In a martial context, and I think that's extremely important. And especially when someone's attacking you with a weapon. I think a lot of people in a real life situation put themselves in an unnecessary amount of danger if they have unarmed martial arts experience. Because people will usually stand very close in unarmed martial arts.
Yeah.
And
my go-to is just going to be space and running.
Yeah.
If you pull a knife on me, it's like I don't care how much jujitsu or whatever you're doing.
Yeah.
Like, dude, like I'm out.
Jiu-jitsu is the worst one for a real life situation, in my personal opinion, because of pocket knives.
Yeah.
It's the last place you want to be is tangled up with somebody if they've got a pocket knife.
I remember during the pandemic, I was going to a Mariners game, and there was a homeless guy with a throwing axe sitting right on Alaskan Way, just watching us all pass by, and he was thumbing his throwing axe. I was like, "What is going on?" Like, there's the closest I've been to a practical situation where sword fighting might have benefited me.
But having that good understanding, I think of I've done some Muay Thai and American kickboxing too. So
Nice.
Having that kind of like multifaceted understanding, and like what you were saying about reading somebody, creating space, because you watch so many street fights and like people get knocked out because they just come right up to you, chest up, and square up to you, and it's like that's like the worst thing you can do in a real street fight. So doing what you guys are doing, or most martial arts will. The first thing is just teaching situational awareness of what's going on in this, when this person starts squaring up to you.
And establishing some comfort probably too, instead of being
And the more you do it, the more comfortable. I mean, like if someone was squaring up to me, I'm like this close to people 5 days a week sometimes. And it's like, for me, it's no big deal. And I'm sure for you guys too, they'd probably feel pretty comfortable if somebody started squaring up to them.
Eventually, yeah. I mean, you first come in, it's new kind of stuff. You get your gear, and you're finally going into spar. Most guys are like a little jittery, amped up, got all the adrenaline. But after you've been doing it for a few years, it's like, oh, this is Tuesday. This is great. This is comfortable. Yeah. And a certain comfort with that, it can be. It's definitely good, but it can also be dangerous. So if you get too comfortable. You end up getting sniped. And I think that's where I think it's
trying to keep that edge.
Yeah. So like, the moment you change range, so for example, if you're used to boxing, right? And you're used to being able to, do this kind of stuff around someone's punches, and then you put something in their hand that's this much longer, you can't do that anymore. It changes your game. Sorry, I'm messing up your mic here.
No, you're good.
That's where that gun comes in handy, I think.
Yeah. So, what do you think the future holds for what you're doing? What are you hoping to? What are you hoping the sport grows into? Like, what would you like to see? Are there any aspirations when you look at this field that you're in? You're like,
sport or martial arts.
This is where I'd like to see it go to.
Right. Well, I kind of fell into HEMA, like I said, just it's them parks, man. They'll get you. And now we're at a point where we've got our own place. We're doing all of our classes over at Poulsbo Parks and Rec for the moment, and that's actually a change for us. We've been there, I want to say 1.5 years, 2 years maybe now.
At Poulsbo Parks and Rec.
Poulsbo Parks and Rec. We just offer it through the city.
Okay.
And we've got 20 plus guys coming to Longsword every week. We got 15, 20 guys coming to Rapier, 15 guys or so coming to Saber classes. Some of them are repeats, but about 50 guys, over 100 on our Discord.
Wow.
So yeah, it's definitely growing here, which is more than I ever expected. When I was with the SCA, I'd be hard pressed to get 5 guys to a practice at a time.
Sure.
And I think a lot of it just has to do with the historical dorkiness aspect of it. People come in and they're like, okay, these guys are all dressed in liripipe hoods, looking like they're going to a medieval fair. And, people drive by and they're taking the hobbits' to Isengard. Nobody... It's embarrassing to a certain degree until you get over that, right?
Yeah.
Dude, if you knew the amount of Lord of the Rings memes that we have thrown back and forth with each other over the last couple of years.
Yeah.
Anyway, go ahead.
So I think that's one of the reasons that I really like HEMA is that, it's not looking at this as a fair or some kind of, recreationist thing.
Right.
This is the martial art. We're studying from, manuals that were written in the 1300s, 1400s, 1500s, 1600s.
Wow.
It is a recreation of the actual way that you do this from the source. And, people come in, we use modern gear, you look sharp, you don't have to come up with a silly name. And I think that's much more comfortable for most people,
right.
especially nowadays. And especially people that are not already in that I've given up on my image category. I've got nothing against the SCA. The SCA is jam-packed full of really cool people.
Yeah.
But the thing is that nerds and dorks tend to be early adopters of most things, and I love them for that.
Oh, that's a great statement. Nerds and dorks tend to be the early adopters of things.
Exactly. Because they're not super worried about their image. They're not worried about how their friends and coworkers are viewing them. They're already, I'm already a nerd. I'm okay with that. I'm comfortable with that.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of people that are not comfortable with that. And they want to be, normal, modern humans and, look good and be respected and all that fun stuff. And, you can still get that and be a nerd. But I think that nerd aspect turns a lot of people off of organizations like the SCA.
Sure.
So we come in, we say, okay, like I said, modern gear, you're looking sharp, it's a real martial art. I think people really resonate with that, and they're more interested, less hesitant, I should say.
Yeah.
To join up and come and learn.
Yeah. Well, and just observing the guys, because I think we shared the court maybe 3 times, and every time I was kind of I was like it dawned on me, I was like, these guys are actually pretty invested, and it seems like they're not just swinging a large piece of metal around for the fun of it.
Right.
And I could hear them talking to each other about what they were doing and getting really into the weeds. Technique-wise. And
it's a lot of weeds.
Every time I see them, it's with the long swords. It's with those huge...
The group that goes out to Robb Park, they're specifically from our longsword class, and that's not an official practice. That's just something they do in addition.
Right.
I think that was started by Riley and Daniel, because they're out there in Poulsbo. Then we probably have Ethan, Tyler, and a couple other guys join them on occasion.
Tyler's the one I've seen there consistently, but I'm sure they're there more often than I'm seeing them.
I think that's pretty much. I think they do it a couple times a week. I haven't been able to get out there because, right during that time, I'm teaching Italian rapier.
Yeah, I mean they're filming it too. They got a sweet camera set up and everything. You tell them to get it on your YouTube channel.
Yeah, they've sent me one video of from there. I haven't seen much of their other content. I know they have a YouTube channel as well.
Okay.
So
need to get some collabs going on.
Have you seen? Because I think I've mostly seen it with long swords, but they're incorporating this it's probably SCA style long sword, they're wearing full armor and it's UFC style. They incorporate jiu-jitsu but they're using swords and they just beat the hell out of each other. Have you seen this? I just saw it recently. Where they're turning it into more of a kind of a watching sport. Yeah,
I want to say what the M1 Medieval 1,
something like that. It is nuts.
Yep. So those guys, you also have there's actually a whole bunch of those. So there's EMP who do full contact steel armor fighting with weapons as well. There's M1, which is Medieval 1 kickboxing and
wow,
and jiu-jitsu and the whole bit. They've got groups like the Dog Brothers that have been around forever that do mostly stick fights, but they're full contact and they really hurt each other. Those guys are crazy. There's Boo Hurt. There's Battle of Nations. There's all kinds of stuff. A lot of those organizations are like the armored ones, right? So they're putting on all kinds of armor, and they're really trying to kill each other. I was never a huge fan of that personally. I prefer what we call in German longsword, which is what I teach, Blossfechten, which means unarmored combat. And there's also Harnessfechten, which is armored combat. I find the armored combat odd, though, because it's just really, really hard to do well.
Historically, is there like an honor factor between the two of them, or like in Germany, like do they do armored versus non-armored, and is there like a preference?
You'd pretty much never see armored versus unarmored. It's kind of complex with armored fighting, because everything that you would do in real life to hurt someone that's in armor, you can't do for safety reasons, because you can use it to hurt someone in armor. So it's like the very thing that you're trying to practice, you can't practice, because if you did it correctly, it would bypass the armor. So, for example, in armored fighting, you wouldn't use a sword because armor is incredibly effective against swords. So slashing damage is completely negated by armor.
Would the rapier or however you say it, would that be more effective against an armored person?
I mean,
like a penetration?
I wouldn't say so. Because you're not going to stab through armor very well. I mean, maybe through mail, but usually when people go armored fighting, they're not using mail. Mail, right? Yeah. So it's like the little chain mail they say nowadays. It was just called mail back then.
Oh, okay.
But you might be able to thrust through some mail with a rapier, possibly, depending on how good your rapier is. I think breaking a rapier might be a likelihood in that case as well. But they're really from very different times. By the time you have the rapier, you've already got muskets. Armor is kind of on the way out. No one was using mail at that point. Everyone was using, plate. You might find like a cuirassier, which would have like a breastplate, but their head would be open, their arms and legs would be available for thrusting. But they're just from really different time periods, like hundreds of years apart. But generally speaking, if you're fighting Harnessfechten, which is the armored fighting, you would be using a weapon that is designed to hurt someone through armor, right? You'd be using a warhammer or a poleaxe, or something that can give you a much greater hit, a hammer. Or you would be looking to wrestle someone to the ground and then take out your dagger and then stab them in the eye holes, or under here, or under the armpit, or in the groin, or something like that, where they don't have armor. Ugh. Yeah, and you can't do any of that in a safe context. It's impossible. Armored fighting
like
gets
a miserable way to fight.
Yeah, it's not fun. I've fought in armor before. I've done it. It's not my personal favorite. I prefer unarmored fighting. It's much more interesting, in my opinion.
Yeah, I was at Viking Fest, and they had some sort of a blend of the two. The guys had the shields, but then they had like sticks. Yeah, it was like a big, tough stick made to look like a sword.
Rattan, no doubt.
I guess, and they just wailed on each other. They just went after it.
Yeah, so that's from the SCA tradition.
Okay,
I would say is the source of that, and there's a few different organizations that do it. And there are things that I like about it. I've done it. It's fun. You just get to whack people really, really, really hard. At the same time, though, I feel like it's had that same kind of aberration, that same kind of corruption, based on the equipment and the rules. Those are the two things that really kind of define a weapons-based martial art. So, for example, if you look at modern fencing, we have those incredibly skinny little weapons. Yeah. The equipment changes how you can use it. You can do things with that you can't do with a real sword. Right. And it doesn't really represent any particular weapon.
Sure.
Then you have rule sets. The way that you count points makes a huge difference in the way people compete. So, for example, in modern fencing, if I stab you and then you immediately stab me, I hit you first, so it's my point, which makes no sense with real swords. I stab you, you stab me, we are both losers.
Right.
So in HEMA, we have much greater emphasis on hitting and not being hit. And then, we take a look at, for example, SCA Heavy, which is, the guys in armor and they're hitting people with the big sticks.
Yeah.
Well, their equipment is already wrong. You've got a stick, and they usually have these big old basket hilts around their hands to protect their hands.
Right.
Didn't have those in history. Those did not exist until well after the age of armor. So it's like we're already using the wrong equipment. And that stick behaves differently than a real sword. It doesn't have the same properties as a real sword. It's much more akin to, say, cudgel fighting with a shield and armor, which I don't think we really saw much of in history. And then, of course, the way that they count those points as well. So, for example, in SCA Heavy, they imagine that they're wearing a male hauberk, which is basically, a shirt that comes down to about, the forearms and then down to about the knees of male, that chain mail.
Yeah. They imagine that they're wearing 15 to 20 extra pounds.
Exactly. They count points as if that's what their protection was. Oh, also with a skull cap, right? And so it's like they say, okay, you have to hit somebody hard enough that you would damage them through mail. But that's not how it works with swords.
Interesting.
Mail is really good at defending against swords.
Right.
So chopping somebody shouldn't be any points. And of course, when you thrust with like a stick like that, you can't really get much force. So you thrust somebody in that organization, they say, oh, well, that wasn't very strong. I didn't feel it. I don't think it would have hurt me through the mail, so it's no points. Even though thrusting is the way you get through mail.
Interesting.
So it's like everything seems to be inverted. But that said, it's a really fun game. They have a lot of fun with it.
Yeah.
So I've got no problem with it. I just prefer the martial art rather than the game.
So at your studio, do you guys also do stuff with like daggers, and do you do a lot of like something that kind of going back to the how applicable is it to a street fight? Do you guys train like knives and stuff at your studio?
So we, I think the closest thing we get to is parrying daggers. So oftentimes when you're using a rapier, you'll have an offhand weapon, which is a parrying dagger. And it's basically about an 18-inch blade, double-edged, and it's got hand protection. It's got keons, the little curly pieces of metal that come off the front. And mostly what you're doing with that is you're looking to grasp your opponent's weapon and control it while you stab them with your sword. But we also have a whole lot of fun fighting with just the daggers, or, we do like 2 daggers versus 1 sword, kind of an asymmetrical kind of thing. So we do that kind of thing, absolutely. In fact, I would say the parrying dagger is probably the best fighting knife that's ever existed, but nobody ever carried them by themselves. Now you can get a certain amount of understanding, but it's not quite the same as using like a modern knife, because you don't have the same properties. It's very unlikely you'd be carrying an 18-inch dagger, or anything with hand protection and keons. So
can't get that through TSA security.
Yep. No, I don't think so. Back in the day, there was a lot of writing in in the sources, for for rondel daggers. Now, a rondel dagger is basically just a very simple hilt. It's got a circle at the bottom. It's got a circle right between the handle and the blade, and it's got a nice long, oftentimes triangular-shaped blade, which is mostly just for stabbing. There's a lot of source material in HEMA about that, and there are places that study that. I've never been super interested in getting into all that, just because, again, it's so different than modern knives, so the techniques are very different. And, HEMA covers hundreds of years and lots of different civilizations, so there's somewhere on the order of about 150 to 200 different martial arts within that historical European martial arts umbrella. Wow. And depending on where you go, some people have studied this and some people have studied that, and different schools teach different things. So you might find a place that does a lot of rondel dagger work, or a place that does pole arms, or a place that does German longsword, or a place that does Italian longsword, or a place that does this Italian master versus that Italian master. So it's very diverse.
Do you have a hard time watching movies with swords
Yes.
in them?
I try and appreciate it for what it is. When you're making a movie, imagine that in fact, let's go with you, Adam. Imagine that you're watching a movie about jiu-jitsu, and you have 10 guys that are amazing at jiu-jitsu, and none of them are good actors. So you go out and you find the person that you want to be the actor in the film, and you have your 10 guys try and teach that actor how to be good at jiu-jitsu in 3 weeks.
Yeah, it doesn't work.
It doesn't work.
There's only one that has been successful, in my opinion, for jiu-jitsu, and that would be
Tom Hardy.
Well, no. Well, Tom Hardy does jiu-jitsu, but in an actual acting situation, the John Wick movies are pretty close. Pretty close. He does some stuff in there where, doing jiu-jitsu, and you're looking at it, you're like, oh, he just did like an effective X sweep and then came up and shot him in the face. That's cool.
That's funny
That's a good
because
combo,
you
eh?
say it's the most realistic representation, but it might be the most unrealistic movie ever made.
Well, truth.
He kills like 100 guys a minute.
I think on a one-off standpoint, just like if it was like one dude, it's
he
like
was using something that was real. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, you're absolutely right. So what is for swords? I mean, is Princess Bride? Like, what is the most?
Princess Bride has probably the most iconic duel in movie history, especially nowadays.
I would think so.
Do you hear the Inigo Montoya quote a lot in your studio?
Yes, actually, we all love the Princess Bride. Not necessarily because the sword work was incredible.
Yeah.
I mean, they're using rapiers.
Yeah.
But they do a lot of cutting. It's more like a saber fight. Which is fine. It's a movie, and I think they did a serviceable job with it. But it's a movie sword fight. Right. It was a lot of fun. It was a great
comedy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It was a great storytelling fight. So I really love that movie. I love that fight.
Yeah.
But it's not accurate.
Right.
Oddly enough, if you look at really old movies, you see better sword fighting.
Really?
Yeah, because sword fighting was a big deal in Hollywood for years and years and years. And so you would have guys that were actors that had very specific skill sets, right? So it's like if you wanted a dancer or a singer, in a movie, you would hire an actor that was a professional dancer or singer or sword fighter. And you had, guys that were going into acting. They're like, okay, I need to build my resume. I'm not going to be just good at acting. I'm going to be good at acting. And then I'm going to be really good with, fencing, or I'm going to be really good with singing or dancing or whatever other skill it was. So you had these people that were studying, fencing for years before they got into acting because they wanted to do those kind of movies. So you look at guys like Errol Flynn, there was great fencing in those early Robin Hood movies, all kinds of places, Captain Blood. You got, the Zorro films, the Mark of Zorro back in the day, like the black and white version. It was all gymnasium saber, which are a little bit lighter sabers. We use a little bit heavier, generally speaking, for like real combat, or I should say HEMA combat. But still, excellent saber technique, much faster, more precise fighting in those old movies because they were already fencers.
So we're coming close to time here, but one of our questions is, you would probably be the one that might know this. Do you know the identity of Bowstaff Guy from Bremerton? Who is Bowstaff Guy?
Bowstaff Guy. I have no idea who Bowstaff Guy is.
You don't know who I'm talking about? The guy that stood on Warren and 11th for years with a bowstaff and just
swung it around,
let her rip
for hours.
I've never even heard of this.
Really?
This is news to me.
Oh, dude, this is like the ultimate Bremerton meme. All right,
well, it was right at a stoplight cross section. He was in this little patch of green field behind the sidewalk, and he had this bow staff, and he was just twirling it around. He'd be there for hours.
No kidding.
Like every day for years.
Now, I've known a couple people like that, but I don't think they were in Bremerton.
Do you guys utilize, thinking about movies too, and thinking about like Darth Maul, do you guys utilize any like double swords like that? Or is that historically accurate at all?
Double swords is not accurate in any way.
Okay.
Generally speaking, if you have a blade on both sides of a weapon, one of those is always pointing at you.
Yeah.
So it's a bad idea. Now you do see a certain amount of that in history, but it's in a very different form, right? So the longer handle you have on a weapon, the more reach it has, right? So you never hold a weapon in the middle. There are certain situations, but generally speaking, if you're using a polearm, you don't hold it in the middle because you're trying to maximize your reach. So you'd have one side, one end basically down in your hand, and you'd be holding it kind of quarter-wise. So you'd have the long part way, way, way out in front of you, right? And we see that with, staff, in like Portuguese staff, jogo de pau. We see that with spears. We see that with glaives. We see that with halberds. We see that with basically every polearm ever made. Mm-hmm. Now, because you have that long part sticking way out in front of you, the best way to get in and hurt somebody that's using that kind of long weapon is to bind against that long part and then push in with a shorter weapon and hit them. And so that's when we see that back end turning around and using the short part. And you will oftentimes in history see, like a butt spike or some kind of less lethal, sharpened bit on the back end. to use for hitting or striking or thrusting or whatever. But it's usually like, this is a very diminutive last resort. Someone's already got in. I just need to turn it around and use the short part. And then the really good stuff is on the long end.
The really good stuff. That's awesome.
Awesome. Well,
go
ahead.
Well, I was just going to ask about your mom, because you said that she is kind of like that's where your roots come from, as far as
legacy, man.
So she competed at what level?
Oh, she was never anything, incredible. I mean, she was a great fencer back in the day. She would go over and fight with the boys and everything, but it was just kind of local, Olympic college, modern fencing club.
Yeah.
But she taught me a lot. I keep trying to get her to come out, but she's in her 70s now, and she thinks she's too old.
You only live once.
Right?
Yeah.
Funny thing is, she wouldn't even be the oldest guy there.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, we got a Bob over there. He's still doing Italian rapier at 76.
Wow.
And he started at 75. Got started.
Bob.
Yeah, old Bob.
Oh, Bob.
In fact, I'm leaving here to go give Bob a private lesson.
Oh, sweet. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
That's been fun.
Yeah,
really
give us
fun.
a quick, just one last summary for anybody who's interested in getting into it. Where should they go? What should they do?
Sure.
How much should they save up for their first longsword?
Honestly, you should not save any money. If you're interested in, longsword, rapier, British military saber, Highland broadsword, whatever it is, just go to Poulsbo Parks and Rec. You can walk right in. You can check out the classes. You can sign up online. You can give them a call, and you can sign up over the phone. Basically, you just pick a class. It's once a week for each class. We have Mondays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays at the moment. And those are all 7 to 9. And come on down. You don't need any kind of gear. We have loaner gear. At some point, you're going to spend a bunch of money, but it's really not too bad.
Yeah. Okay.
Cool.
Sweet.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah,
thank you, everybody.
thank you.
We'll
Thank
see you
you,
next
everybody.
week.
Bye-bye.